Welcome to the streaming webinar Eigenpairs Live. This webinar will demonstrate how Maple can enhance the task of teaching the eigenpair concept and will show how Maple bridges the gaps between the concept and the algorithms by which the students are expected to practice finding eigenpairs. I'm joined here today with Dr. Robert Lopez, an emeritus professor of mathematics at the Rose-Hulman Institute of Technology, as well as a Maple Fellow here at MapleSoft. Dr. Lopez is an award-winning educator in mathematics and the author of several books, including Advanced Engineering Mathematics. For over 2 decades, Dr. Lopez has been a visionary figure in the introduction of Maple technology into the undergraduate education. In just a moment, I'm going to pass the floor to Dr. Lopez so he can begin today's webinar. But first, I wanted to encourage you to enter any questions you have during the presentation, and we will get to as many as we can at the end. With that, let's get started. Dr. Lopez, welcome.
Thanks, Kim. I assume that everyone watching this presentation today knows all they need to know about eigenvalues and eigenvectors and how to find them. What I want to bring to the table today is what role does Maple play in the pedagogy for the student first learning about eigenvectors and eigenvalues. How does the Maple technology help that student? How can we make maximal use of this technology to do the most good? In the mid-1980s to the late 1980s, there were a couple of researchers in math ed who looked at the role of tools like Maple, and they came up with the phrase resequencing concepts and skills. And the paradigm that they were looking at was leading with the concept and letting Maple do the heavy lifting so that the concept could be explored first before skills were stressed. And the typical textbook teaches skills, with the underlying intimation being, learn these skills, and then we'll let you do something useful. Well, you know what that does to students. So let's see how Maple can be employed in presenting the concept and clarifying the concept and clarifying the role and nature of the computations that relate to that concept in this instance. Now, I want to start with something concrete, like fixed point. So a function y equals f of x has a fixed point if x equals f of x as a solution. Let's try something like that. Let's put some function in place. Now I'm going to do x squared minus 3x plus 7. I'd like to see if that can be made equal to x. Let's do it graphically. So I'm going to look at a graph. And you see these two curves do not intersect. There's no solution to x squared minus 3x plus 7 equals x. But what if we change this to minus 7? Well, now they intersect, but they intersect more than once. Take away from this, fixed point for a function could be none, maybe 1, many. So there is some variety here, and we should expect that same kind of variety when we look at fixed point for a matrix. So that's what we want to do first. I'm going to delete this stuff. I'm going to install some linear algebra package. So let's install the student linear algebra package. I picked the student package because it's much more forgiving on things being real. And we'll stick to that for today. Okay, I need a matrix. So I'm going to use this matrix palette. I'm going to put in this matrix using the tab key to move from field to field. And I need to give this a name. Everybody gives, I don't know if it's everybody, but it's pretty common to call the matrix A. And now I want a vector, generic vector, whose components are A and B, because I want to see what happens to AX. So let's assign name here. And let's ask the question, can AX equal X? So here's AX, and I put a period for non-commutative multiplication. Can that equal X? Well, this is a vector, and this is a vector. I want to know if they are component for component equal. So the right-click menu, the context menu, gives me an equate. So this forms the two equations that correspond to equating components. Well, these two equations are homogeneous. They only have A and B in it. Let's see what Maple's got to say about these equations. So I will pick solve, and Maple comes up with a solution. It says A equals minus 2B. What does that mean for the vector X? Well, there's the vector X. Let's evaluate that. A equals minus 2B. So if B is 1, then A is minus 2. How about I call this by some name, capital X, let's say. So we have this vector X. And for sure, if we compare X with A times X, we see they are the same. Now, a vector has length and direction. So this vector has its length and its direction preserved. Well, let's back off on that a bit. Let's modify that. Let's preserve one, but not the other. Suppose we just seek to preserve, what shall we preserve? How about we just preserve the direction? Let's accept the change in length. So we have A times X, and then we need a multiple of X. So let's put in a multiple, and for some reason or other, that multiple is so often lambda. Can these two vectors be the same? Well, it may require modifying the value of lambda to make these the same. So let's do equate. And now we have two homogeneous equations again, and there's a lambda. For some values of lambda, these equations may have solution just 0, 0. These represent lines. The lines may pass through the origin. Can you choose a lambda so that you do better than just having the 0, 0 as the solution? Well, let's try looking at this graphically. I'm going to bring up the plot builder, and I'm going to ask Maple to build me an interactive plot with one parameter. The parameter is lambda. The slider controls the value of lambda, and as I move that slider and lambda changes, you see that the two lines pass through the origin. That's the only solution unless the lines are coincident. And they are coincident when lambda is 1, but we know that. That's what this calculation here told us. I wonder if there's any other value of lambda for which the lines are coincident. Yes, 6. So there is a value of lambda over and above that 1 for which the lines are coincident, which means that there would be a non-zero solution to the equation AX equals lambda x. Well, I think it's time to solve these equations. So the way we can solve these equations is to eliminate lambda and select the equation that's left after we eliminate lambda. So we do select item number 2. This is equal to 0. Maple doesn't put it, but it understands that that's what you want. Let's solve this for A. It'll be A in terms of B. 2 solutions. This one we already got. Well, what about this one? What vector does that give us? So here is x. Let's evaluate that so as to satisfy this condition. If I make b equals 2, now I'll be dealing with integers, but then a would have to be 1. So let's call this vector y. Y. And try ay. So here's y, and here's a times y, and let's see what that looks like. Well, the vector is 1, 2, and ay is 6, 12. That's 6 times 1, 2, and here's that 6. And this means the direction of this vector has been preserved, but it had to be stretched. Now, here's an aside. This is truly an aside. Make it even bigger. Okay. Now, when you think about this, there are matrices that rotate the plane. So a pure rotation would preserve the length of every vector. Can you have a matrix that preserves the length of 2 vectors? We just saw one that preserved the length of 1 vector. Can you have a matrix that preserves the length of 2 vectors? Well, here's a matrix. Here are 2 vectors, v1 and v2. The length of v1, Euclidean length, is the square root of 2. I think that's pretty obvious. And if you multiply av1, you get 1, 1. It has length square root of 2. So here's this other vector, 17 minus 19. Its length is 5 root 26. That's actually the square root of 650. av2 is the vector 1123, and its length is the same. So here's a case where the length of 2 vectors exactly been preserved, but their directions have not. However, for this same matrix, if you look at the vectors x1 and x2, this vector and this vector, ax1 has its direction preserved, and the stretch factor is 3. And this vector has its direction preserved. If you don't worry about the flip in direction with the minus sign, multiplicative factor, and you can think of it as 2 or minus 2, however you want to define this. Okay, so you can have different scenarios here, but it turns out that this paradigm is the more useful one in mathematics. Preservation of the direction with maybe accepting a stretch factor. Okay, so much for that aside. Let's try another matrix. So I'm going to put another matrix in here. And this one, I will do 5 minus 1 minus 1, 5. Call this, again, A. So Maple will say to me, you've already used A. You want to overwrite that name? Yes. Okay. So are there vectors for which AX and X align, have the same direction? So here's AX, and here's X. Now, there is in this linear algebra package an angle between 2 vectors, and if you want to see that I'm going to be making that angle or setting that angle equal to 0, I'll do that. And if I didn't put the equal 0 and I said solve, Maple would say, oh, you meant to put that equal to 0. So I want to see if there are any solutions to this. Suppose I solve for A, and I have two solutions, A equals B and A equals minus B. Well, what are those vectors? What vectors would I get if I said A equals B and A equals minus B? So if A equals B, I'll make them both 1s and call this capital X. Yes, I had used that before, so please do it again. All right, move this up. And the other one is X. Let's set A equals minus B. Where'd that go? Evaluate at a point. Well, one will be positive 1 and one will be negative 1. Oh, there's 1. Okay, let's call this Y. And again, I think I used Y before, so maybe will remind me that I used Y before. And now let's see what happens. X compared to A times X. 1, 1, and 4, 4. So the multiplier was 4. Direction preserved, multiplier is 4. How about Y? Y and A times Y. Minus 1, 1, minus 6, 6. Direction preserved, multiplier is 6. So 4 and 6 are these two special numbers. Let's take a geometric look at that. So A times X and a multiple of X equated gives us a pair of equations. And as we did before, if we look at this geometrically, we can perhaps get Maple to make us an interactive plot with a parameter. Here's the slider that controls the parameter, and you can see from many values, in fact most values of the parameter, these two equations represent lines through the origin. These are homogeneous equations, these are lines through the origin, the only point in common is 0, 0. But there is one place where the lines coincide, that's 4, and another place where the lines coincide, that's 6. You can see those numbers down here, okay? All right, so this pair of equations can be put into matrix form if the variables are declared to be A and B. That's the system matrix for these two equations. The 0, 0 is the right-hand side. So these are homogeneous equations. That's A minus lambda's on the diagonals, and the way you can represent that is to say A minus lambda identity, A minus lambda I. So here's just Maple being used as a typewriter. This is the algebra that this matrix represents. You have AX equals lambda x, and then you want to bring everything to the left-hand side, so you have AX minus, oh, I don't want to do that, and that's equal to 0. And that 0 is the vector 0, so I'll make it bold. And then factor the left-hand side. So you see that there is an x common, so you write A minus, now we have lambda. But A is a matrix, lambda is a scalar. You just can't make a subtraction, matrix minus scalar. So you need to just get the lambdas on this diagonal, and the identity matrix, which has ones on that diagonal, would do it. So it's a minus lambda I, there's your x, and there's your equal to 0, and that's bold. And this matrix, oh, stop moving around here, this matrix here, a minus lambda I, that matrix has to be singular, because these are homogeneous equations. If that matrix is non-singular, the only solution is x equals 0. So to get solutions that are not trivial, this has to be a singular matrix. So that's what's lurking behind the algebra here. In fact, let's demonstrate that. A minus 4, oh, wrong A, capital A minus 4I. So I want an identity matrix. So let's put in an identity matrix. There's A minus 4I. And the next step is to row reduce that, because you're trying to solve equations, homogeneous equations that you're trying to solve. Now, that's supposed to give you a null vector, the solution of ax, a minus lambda I x equals 0. So you can get that null vector by having Maple give you a basis for the null space. And that vector is 1, 1. So how does this row-reduced matrix give you this vector 1, 1, which, if you remember, is the vector x? Well, you have to interpret this non-zero row as the equation a minus b equals 0, which means a equals b. And that's what this is, a equals b, where those constants are 1s. And if we do the same thing with a minus 6i, wait a minute, let's get a minus 6i. Let's row reduce that, because that's how you solve equations. You have a solution of a different set of homogeneous equations. So that null space vector is this one, and if you remember, that was the vector we called y. So how does this row-reduced matrix tell you minus 1, 1? Well, you read this as an equation. A plus b equals 0. A plus b equals 0. A equals minus b, so a and b differ in sign. Make 1, 1, the other one is minus 1. So let's take one more look at this algebra. Let's look at a minus lambda I. This is the matrix that has to be singular. Otherwise, everything just goes to 0, and don't take that literally. Things go to 0, nothing's good happening here. We want this matrix to be singular. To make that matrix singular, make its determinant be 0. So let's get its determinant. There's its determinant. Set that equal to 0. Okay, you set that equal to 0, and then you solve whether you set it equal to 0 or not. As soon as you apply solve, Maple assumes you meant it equal to 0, and you get these two numbers, lambda equals 4 and lambda equals 6. So if you take the matrix A and you ask Maple in this section called eigenvalues, etc., what is the characteristic matrix? You get almost a minus lambda I. In fact, what you get is lambda I minus a. That's how Maple has been programmed, to give you lambda I minus a. It's called a characteristic matrix. So you need to take the determinant, but if you ask Maple in that same section, what is the characteristic polynomial? You get the determinant of the characteristic matrix. And finally, if you ask Maple, here's A, and you ask Maple, all right, you got all this stuff, all this machinery in there, What would the eigenvectors be? You get back a vector of eigenvalues. That's what these stretch factors are called, eigenvalues. And a matrix whose columns are the eigenvectors. Now you can split that into column vectors. So let's grab this matrix, and then up here we say split into columns, and there you have the two eigenvectors. And the first vector, the first component of the eigenvalue vector belongs to the first column of this matrix. The second one to the second column. That's where the idea of eigenpairs. They go in pairs. There's a stretch factor and there's the direction. Okay? So I'm going to summarize with a picture. So here is my picture that summarizes what we've been trying to do. The green circle is a unit circle, and the red arrow is a unit vector. It is controlled by this slider. As I move the slider, the degrees 0 to 360, they're measured from the horizontal. That will move that unit vector. The black vector is AX, where X is the red vector. For some values of theta, these two vectors do not align. In fact, for most values, they don't align. But there are a couple of values for which they do align, and AX has length 4. There's that 4. And I believe if you come around here, they will align again, and this time AX equals 6. So there are those two eigenvalues, that stretch factor by which vectors in the invariant direction stretch. Okay, let's go to a 3 by 3. Are things radically different if you go to a 3 by 3? So let's try a 3 by 3. What happened here? I know what happened here. From this morning, all of this stuff got saved, which I didn't intend saving. So I want to get rid of that. And I will execute this stuff. So here's my matrix. It's called A. You don't need to see me punch numbers into that template because you've already seen me do that once. And X now has 3 components, A, B, C. Okay, I want to do essentially the same kind of an investigation. Let's look at A, X, and lambda X. These vectors should be the same for some value of lambda. So equate. What do we have? We have 3 equations in ABC. They're homogeneous. That makes them equations of a plane through the origin. Each one is a plane through the origin. So we have 3 planes. For general values of lambda, the only point in common for those 3 planes is 0, 0, 0. I wonder if we can draw a picture of that. So let's go to plots and pick the plot builder and ask Maple to build us an interactive plot with 1 parameter. The parameter is lambda. Let's see. Well, there, you can see you have 3 planes. As you move lambda, the planes are moving around. It's very hard to tell if at some point they collapse so that you have more than just 0, 0, 0 as a solution. Very hard to see that. Disappointing, but let's see if maybe we put that into the worksheet and doctor this up a bit. So I find taking the external light off makes things a little better, but it's still hard to tell what is happening to the intersections of those planes. So I have to try something else. I have to think about this. What am I really trying to see? There's a plane, they intersect in a line, maybe. There's a plane, intersect in a line, maybe. And this one, and this one. So maybe what I want to look at are the pairwise intersections. I have 3 lines of intersection of these 3 planes. Those lines would all include the origin. Let's take a look at that. Let's see if that helps us to visualize what's going on. So these are just the lines. Red is one line of intersection, green is another, black is a third. This slider up here will change the value of lambda. Watch the value of lambda. When lambda is 1, those lines coincide. Keep moving lambda. When lambda is 2, the lines coincide. When lambda is 3, the lines coincide. So there are 3 values of lambda which cause those planes to have mutual pairwise intersections with your lines. The lines coincide, so in that case you will not have to settle for the 0, 0, 0 solution. Now maybe we can do some of the computation algebraically. So let's look at these equations. It has an equation labeled 2. Let's make use of that equation label. Control L, and I type 2, hit the enter key. I recall those equations. Let's eliminate lambda, like we did earlier. Eliminate a variable, eliminate lambda. And this is the stuff we want to look at, so grab it. That's select element 2. And there are 2 equations now. They're in ABC. Lambda is out. 2 equations. I can solve for 2 out of the 3 unknowns. So let's solve for variables B and C. B and C. There are 3 solutions. I'm going to call this string of solutions by some name S so I can get to them. 3 solutions. These tell me things about A, B, and C, which will tell me something about the vector x. So let's see what those solutions tell me about the vector x. So here's the vector x, and I want to evaluate it when S is the first solution. So A0A, I'd like to make A1 to keep things simple. Here's 1. And I'm going to call this X, capital X. So it has a name and I can refer to it. And I got to do this 2 more times. Here is X, S, shift down here to 2. A again, let's make that again 1. And call this vector Y. And finally, one more time, X, the third one, AAA, let's make the A1, and call this Z. Assigned to a name Z. I'm in Canada. People in Canada call that Z. I'm an American, and I have that letter in my name. I grew up calling that Z. This is my second stint in Canada. In the first stint in Canada, I was younger, and I was more flexible, and I learned to say Z. This is my second stint in Canada, and I'm an old man now, and I'm not flexible. I still call it Z. Sorry. So we have these 3 vectors. Let's see how they behave under multiplication by A. So here is X and A times X. What happens there? 101 and 101. The multiplier is 1. And if you remember from the graphic with the lines, one of those magic numbers was 1. Now let's try y and a times y. 1, 2, 2, 4. The multiplier is 2. And remember one of those magic numbers was 2. And let's try the third one here. Z and a times z. 1, 1, 1, 3, 3, 3. The multiplier is 3. So you have 3 vectors whose direction remains fixed, but there are multipliers. In the first case, it's 1, like in the very first matrix, the 2 by 2 matrix. In the other two, there's a multiplier of 2 and a multiplier of 3. So let's take a look at the algebra by which you might find these multipliers in fixed directions. You have a minus 1 times I. So we need a 3 by 3 identity. So there's a minus 1 times I. And then you have to row reduce that because you're solving equations. So you row reduce that and you get down to here. And from that row reduced matrix, you are supposed to find the solution of a minus 1 times I x equals 0. You're looking for solution of homogeneous equations. You're looking for a basis for the null space. This is the null vector that results, and I believe that is the vector x, is it not? Okay, so let me push this up the screen a bit. So how do you get from this row reduced matrix to this null vector? Well, what is this middle row really saying? Because this is multiplied against ABC. This is really an equation, 0a, 1b, plus 0c equals 0. So this is really saying b equals 0. And that's where the b equals 0 comes from. This is the equation a minus c equals 0. So what is that telling you? A equals c. And isn't that what you have here? A equals c, and that would be picked 1. Well, that's for a minus 1i. What about a minus 2i? What's that going to look like? So let's row reduce. Where did that go? Linear. Oh, wait a minute. I want to do one more thing here. I want to see what that matrix looks like. And push that up the screen. Okay. Row reduce. So there's the row reduced form. You're solving homogeneous equations, so you're really finding the solution, the spanning vectors for the null space. So let's do null space. There is a basis vector, or the basis vector for the null space. How does this row reduced form tell you that vector? Well, what is this equation? It's the equation c equals 0. That's what you have down here, c equals 0. And what does this equation tell you? A minus a half b equals 0. A equals a half b. Whatever you have for b, you take half of it, and there's your a. And this, I believe, is the vector y. Okay, and we're going to do this one more time for the third vector that we found, which was a minus 3i row reduce. And what is the null space spanned by? Vector spaces, null space, 1, 1, 1. And that's the vector z. Okay? So how does this row reduced matrix tell you that the eigenvector corresponding to lambda equals 3 is 1, 1, 1. So you read this as b minus c equals 0. So b equals c. So b and c are the same number. And this equation is a minus c equals 0. A equals c. A and c are the same number. So there's the algebra that the student must master, and any mistake in row reducing leads the student out into left field. That's why letting the student use Maple to do the heavy lifting is so valuable, because they can concentrate on the concept, the flow of the reasoning in mapping out the concept, without having to distract themselves by thinking about the arithmetic. And I have found that to be a very effective way to teach this material. In fact, any material in the undergraduate curriculum. Okay, so let's take one last look at A minus lambda I. Where did that go? Which is this matrix. See, the lambdas are on the diagonal, minus lambda I. And if you get its determinant, where did it go? Where did the determinant go? There's the determinant. Get the determinant, set it equal to 0, and solve. You get those numbers 1, 2, and 3. Now that's where the eigenvalues come from. They are the numbers that make A minus lambda I singular, which means that you get non-zero solutions to A minus lambda I equals 0, which is what you're looking for. So now if you take the matrix A, and you just go to Maple and you say, okay, tell me what the characteristic matrix is. Well, Maple gives you lambda I minus A. Same thing. And if you go to Maple and you say, all right, Maple, you tell me what the characteristic polynomial is. Well, you get the negative of the one we had up here, because A minus lambda I minus A, you set that equal to 0 and you solve. But just think of all the arithmetic that's involved in this, right? Just get this characteristic polynomial from this 3 by 3. That's an enormous amount of work. If you force the student to do that by hand, they get totally distracted from the flow of the ideas. And by the time they get that thing right, they don't care why they got it anymore. Okay. Every once in a while, I got to get up my soapbox. And finally, let's look at A. And you ask Maple, all right, we know what's going on here. We're beginning to understand this stuff. Tell me the eigenvectors. Okay, so there's the 1, 2, and the 3, but you can't depend on the order. It's random. There's some algorithms inside Maple that randomize that order for some reason. Okay, columns are the vectors x, y, and z. Okay, this looks like z. I think that one is this one is x and that one is y. Okay, if you re-execute this, sometimes you can get that to change the order. Yes, now it came out to 3, 1, 2, and so on. Okay, I want to do one more 3 by 3 because it will show some quirks that you might not expect. So one more 3 by 3. Make this bigger, execute it. Now I'm going to call that vector v, because I want the letters x, y, and z free to use later. Okay, so I want to look at a times v. I want this to be the same direction as v. Well, here's a way for 3 by 3. Here's another way you can do this. If you take the cross product of AV and V, and that cross product is 0, those vectors will be collinear. So each of these 3 components has to be 0. So let's make a list out of that. Where are we going here? Conversions to list. Okay, you have 1, 2, 3 expressions. They're equal to 0, so there are 3 equations. Just A, B, and C in there. If you hit it with a simplified, you get a little bit smaller. Doesn't really do much. Okay, so maybe we can just say to Maple, solve for A, B, and C. But lo and behold, something different happens here. You get only 2 solutions. I'm going to call that S. How do I do that? I assign to a name. I'm going to call that S. And I want to see what vectors this gives me. So I will use this evaluation template that's in my favorites palette. If you don't have stuff in your favorites palette, you put it there, you would find stuff like this in the expression palette. See, this is the evaluation template. You right-click on it, you say add to favorites, and you populate your favorites palette to suit yourself. Okay, so here's V, and I want to evaluate that at one of those solutions. I'm going to take the second one first. And there's a multiple of C that I'll set equal to 1. I'll let that be 1. And so I'm going to call this vector X. Assign to a name. Where's Shift? Okay, so there's that one. Well, what about this other one? So we do that again. So here's V. Let's do the first one. S1. Now I have 2 letters in here. I can't play this cute game about evaluate at a point. This is where the student has to see that this can be written as B times some vector. Now, I need a template for a vector. B appears in the first entry. It appears in the second entry. It does not appear in the third entry. But that's not all. You have a C here to tack on, and it has to multiply a vector that has -3 in the first entry, nothing in the second, because there's no C in the middle component, and a 1 in the third component. So these are actually the other 2 vectors I want. The question is, how can we get them efficiently? Well, this is what the student would have to do. Grab this, pull this down here. Now you could use you would use evaluate at a point. Suppose you let B be 0 and C be 1, then this one we could call Y, capital Y. And if you pull this down again, evaluate at a point, and let's make B1 and C0. Okay, and we'll call this one Z. Where is that? Assign to a name, Z. Okay, so how do these vectors behave? If you have X and A times X minus 4 or 1, that 1 got multiplied by 3, that 4 got multiplied by 3. There's a multiplier of 3 for that vector. Now, for Y and Z, they're paired up together. So I'm going to pair them up together. A multiple of Y plus a multiple of Z, and I'm going to multiply A against that. A multiple of Y plus a multiple of Z. What does that all look like? Well, P and 2P, Q and 2Q, 3, 6, 1, 2. The multiplier is 2. So any linear combination of Y and Z has its direction preserved, but it gets multiplied by 2. I got to visualize that. Don't you want to visualize that? So Y and Z together, they would span a plane. What is that plane? How can you get your hands on that plane? Well, the normal to that plane is Y cross Z. If I do an assign here, assign that, and then do n dot the position vector x comma y comma z, and that's equal to 0. There's the equation of the plane. Let's draw that plane. Let's get Maple to draw that plane. Right there. Fine. I like to have the axes framed. It's too much busy work otherwise. And I'm going to make this a surface. Style, surface, and take the light off it so that it's not washed out. And there's the plane. Now what about that other vector, x? One-dimensional, line. So let's do a multiple of x. Convert this to a list so that I can graph it. Where is the conversion to list? And then bring up the plot builder. Let's bring up the plot builder. And the default here is -5 to 5. Let's make it -2 to 2. And on the options, because I'm drawing a line, I want that line to be drawn in black. Here's black, and I want to make it thick. So I'll make that thick, and I'll draw that line. Now I want to add the line to the graph of the plane, so I'm going to do a copy. Here's a copy. I'm going to do a paste. And now I can see what's going on here. There's the line. It's not in the plane. They're slightly separated. Okay, so the line passes through the plane at the origin. Any vector in that plane is invariant in direction under A, but it will be multiplied by 2. And any vector in that line will be invariant along that line, but its length will be multiplied by 3. What have we accomplished? Well, you're down here to the point where you should now begin to realize that we are looking for invariant subspaces. So the plane is a subspace, the line is a subspace. We're decomposing the space into these invariant subspaces. And that's been the profitable way to look at the behavior of a linear transformation in linear algebra. We can do what we have done already. Everything that we've done already is just a repeat. If we look at A minus 3I, let's go back to a 3 by 3I identity and say, okay, what is this? Row reduce it. Here, row reduced. Now, from this row reduced form, we are supposed to get the basis of the null space. So let's do vector spaces here. Null space, that's the vector x, right? Here's our x. Okay, how does this row reduced matrix tell us this vector? Well, again, middle row says b equals 0. That's what we have, b equals 0. 104, that's A plus 4C. So A equals minus C. C is 1, then A is minus 4. Now what happens when you do the other one? A minus 2I. Well, let's see what happens there. Row reduce. And what are we supposed to get out of this? Well, what is the basis for the null space? And you have two vectors. So how does this row-reduced matrix give us these two vectors? And this is really the bugaboo for students. This is where I spend an enormous amount of energy explaining algebra with pencil and paper on the board, marker board. If they could only see what these computations mean, it's so much easier. So this first equation up here is A minus B plus 3C equals 0. And if you isolate the A, how do we do that? Solve. Isolate expression for A. And if we take the vector V, we got to keep moving that, and evaluate it, well, I'll use Control L10 to reference. I didn't want to hit the Enter key until I took away this equals A. You get B minus 3C, BC. Now we saw that already. We've already done that, right? That's up here. We know how to handle that. I won't go over that. We're down here. We know how to proceed from here. I hope I have given some insight into how you might use Maple, not just to give an answer, but to infuse the whole process of presenting a concept, allowing the student to master that concept before they're getting badgered by doing the detritus of the details of the arithmetic, which is the killer for so many students. Okay, I'm going to stop there and see if there are any questions.
All right, now we're moving to our question and answer period. If you do have a question and you haven't answered it yet, now is the time to do it. Our first question today is, I am curious about the matrix you used for your side. Can you show it again? Is it typical for a matrix to have both a pair of vectors preserving direction and a pair of vectors preserving length?
I don't know. I piddled around and, let's go back to that side. I piddled around and came up with that matrix. Let's see how I came up with that matrix. Let's open this. I'll make this a little bigger. Okay, I think what I did was I started out by solving some equations here, right? If you say AV, take its norm, has to equal norm of V, and you do that for both V1 and V2, you will find the four components of your matrix A. I believe it was serendipity at that point that this happened. But I think this would have happened for almost any matrix that you would have come up with for this property. So set out looking for the matrix by imposing the equations that this feature demands, and then something like this is bound to happen, unless for some reason or other the matrix is deficient and you don't get two eigenvectors. Next question.
Okay, next question. You make a big point of not using maple commands. What's the advantage of using this point and click paradigm? I was at Rose-Hulman up until 2003. So I retired in 2003. So all my use of maple in Rose-Hulman was via commands, because this point and click stuff did not exist back then. And it was always a hassle to get the students to learn the commands. The commands always interfered with the math that I was trying to present. So to me, it is very important that the math not be interfered with by the tool that you're using to implement the math. And the easier the tool is, the better. And point and click is certainly, to me, the easiest way to go about doing math in this natural fashion where you're not coming up against the constraints of these commands. Next. Okay, next question. How do you move vectors and matrices around on the screen?
By the grace of Bill Gates. This is not a maple thing. The ability to do that is not a maple thing. So here's a piece of math. You select it, you hold down the control key, and you pull that over, and it is the equivalent of a copy-paste. But it's not as busy as copy-paste, because copy-paste is Control-C, Control-V. So control-drag, and it's a Bill Gates-ism. It's a Windows thing. And I check with people who have a Mac and who run on Linux, and you can do the same thing on those operating systems too. And I find that to be an extremely useful feature of these new interfaces. What else?
Okay. Do all 3x3 matrices have 3 eigenvectors?
No. You have opened a can of worms. A sufficient condition is the matrix is symmetric, in which case you are guaranteed 3, and they turn out to be that they can be made mutually orthogonal eigenvectors. Now, it's a sufficient condition. It's not necessary. We had 3x3s that were not symmetric, and they had 3 eigenvectors. Matrices that don't have 3 eigenvectors have what I'll call, like you make up the difference with these things called generalized eigenvectors. Messy, messy, messy stuff. That's when you start talking about Jordan form. Messy stuff. If you have a minute, I will tell you a very sad story about that generalized eigenvector business, Jordan form. Just recently, the guy Nash, what's his first name? the one who was schizophrenic, just died. 86-year-old. He's in a taxi with his wife on a Jersey Turnpike, and the taxi driver wrecks. He lives, and Nash and his wife get ejected, and they're killed. Well, the story that pointed it out said he had been over to Europe with Louis Nierenberg. Louis Nierenberg was a prof at Koran Institute, New York University. You can tell from my accent I grew up in New York. I went to New York University after I got out of college for a semester. I was teaching high school at the time. It was not the way to go to university. So anyways, I had Louis Nierenberg for a linear algebra course. He taught it out of a little thin little volume, Gelfand, a very abstract linear algebra course. So he's talking about Jordan form. And he's using color chalk to say, well, you decompose the space and over here, and you get this vector, and you decompose the space over here, you get that vector. He's using color chalk to do this. And he runs out of colors. And he says, well, you know what I mean. That was my experience with linear algebra. I didn't learn a hell of a lot of linear algebra from Louis Nierenberg. It wasn't until I went for my master's degree that I sat down with a linear algebra book and said, I better learn some linear algebra. Okay? So that's not so far from what we've done today. Stuff like that made me very, very, very sensitive to the need of the student in the class. They are all ordinary people, except for when you're lucky, you have that really spectacular student. You got to think about the ordinary student who learns from the particular to the general. And a lot of mercy on those students. And this is why I put so much energy into the thought of how can you use a tool like Maple to do a much better job with abstract ideas like eigenpairs than you can with a pencil and paper and colored chalk. Anything else? I think we're over time.
I think we are too. So that's all the questions we have time for today. If you did submit a question, you get an answer. We'll be sure to get back to you. Thank you for joining us for our live streaming webinar. We hope to see you again at a future event.